Great Hinckley Fire. Like a nightmare it comes back to me, the Hinckley Forest Fire of September, 1894. It was, I believe, the greatest tragedy of its kind in American history. 2,500 square miles burned out, mostly in Minnesota, partly in Wisconsin, and a death list of about 500 men, women, and children. The exact number will never be known. 476 bodies were recovered, including the remains of 22 Indians, before the snows of winter put an end to further search. At that time, I was pulling the Duluth Limited on the old St. Paul and Duluth Railway, now part of the Northern Pacific. In those days, unlike it is today, lumbering was the one big industry of the North Woods. Everywhere you went you saw huge piles of logs, busy lumbermen, sawmills at work. In the deep forests were log cabins, each with its little patch of cleared land, and along the right-of-way of the tracks, little clusters of frame houses were growing into fair-sized towns. One of these towns was Hinckley, located 72 miles northeast of St. Paul. It had about 1,200 inhabitants, one-third of whom were regularly employed by a large lumber mill. Lumber for the Hinckley mill was seasoned, floated down the Grindstone River, which ran nearby. The river was crossed by a wagon bridge and 2 railroad bridges, one of the St. Paul and Duluth, the other of the Eastern Minnesota Railway, which was part of the Great Northern System. Hinckley was the crossing point for the 2 rail lines. The day of the big fire was Saturday, September 1, 1894. No rain had fallen in northern Minnesota since April. Maples, pines, oaks, and tamaracks were parched like tinder, rivers had dwindled into streams and streams into dry gullies, sloughs in which the wild waterfowl usually fed had become dry, cracked mud, and over the whole countryside was thrown a mantle of dust. For months fires had broken out here and there, so that the atmosphere for many miles around was blue with a haze of smoke, but so far none of the fires had been serious. At 2 p.m., the northbound Limited stopped at Hinckley on its way from St. Paul to Duluth. The forest fire was creeping closer minute by minute, but the residents of the town weren't afraid. They had not yet seen the flames, so only a handful of them climbed aboard the northbound train. But 40 minutes later things had changed, and when the local freight train that ran between Duluth and Hinckley on the Eastern Minnesota Railway pulled into town, the curtain of smoke was so dense that it darkened the whole community. A wall of flame was closing in from the west, south, and east. Balls of fire were tossed from the top of one tall tree to another, breaking into showers of sparks that spread the blaze with lightning rapidity. The local fire department was already fighting the flames on the extreme western corner of the town. Their equipment was pitifully inadequate. One frame house after another on the edge of town burst into flames. The local freight, pulled by engineer Ed Berry, arrived with 30 empties and 10 loaded cars. Its crew waited for the southbound passenger train, which arrived at 3:25. Then the 2 crews made up a combination train of 5 passenger coaches, 3 boxcars, a caboose, and 2 engines. The frenzied population of Hinckley mobbed this train just as an overpowering heat wave hit the town. Men, women, and children, even animals, dropped dead in the streets. The smoke was suffocating, the streets as dark as midnight. Engineer Berry waited at the depot for 3/4 of an hour for stragglers to get aboard. Then he crossed the bridge over the Little River, and delayed 5 minutes more.
Hurry! Get on the train! Get on the train! The whole town is on fire! Hurry, get on the train! Climb aboard! The train is leaving!
But the ties were burning now, the cars were blistering and smoldering. If they did not pull out now they could never go. So without waiting for anyone else to climb aboard, Berry pulled out. All this time I was on my way from Duluth to St. Paul, at the throttle of the southbound Limited, rapidly approaching Hinckley but not knowing then what was happening. Although it was later that I learned the facts about the mixed train, I'll tell them now. Berry opened the throttle wide, despite the dangerous condition of the track, determined to make a run for it or die in the attempt. His train crossed 19 bridges, most of them burning. On all sides the flames were beating against the train and into the engine cab. Smoke was threatening to suffocate all the human beings who had escaped so far. On account of the darkness, Barry kept his headlight burning, even at that it was difficult to see a few yards ahead. Reaching the next town, Sandstone, they begged the local population to climb aboard while there was yet time.
Climb aboard! The train is leaving!
Only a few did so. The feeling in Sandstone was that even if the flames did engulf Hinckley, which was 9 miles away, Sandstone would still be safe. A few minutes after the train pulled out, the people had good reason to regret their overconfidence. At Partridge, a 20-minute stop was made. Passengers dying of thirst were given water. Engineer Barry was handed a telegraph message to use his own judgment in running the train. The citizens of Partridge, like those of Sandstone, refused to desert their town. Later, they too regretted it. Partridge was wiped out, as were Hinckley and Sandstone. Again at Mansfield and Carrick the special stopped, each time the same performance was repeated. At Carrick the engineer decided to quit. Smoke had blinded his eyes so that he could not trust himself to run the train. But after slight delay, his eyes cleared, and he went on again, not stopping until had pulled his train safely into West Superior. Then he collapsed. Meanwhile, our southbound limited had left Duluth. I was at the throttle, Tom Sullivan was conductor, and Jack McGowan was fireman. When we left Duluth, 2 p.m., we were on time, and we were practically on time when we got to the top of the hill at Hinckley. We had been running through smoke so thick and dense that Brakeman Monahan had lighted the lamps in the coaches. I had the cab lamp lit, but as we reached the hill the smoke cleared and it was broad daylight again and we blew the lights out. Then I saw people coming from both sides of the track and across the bridge. I applied the air and stopped. Just then an old woman and her 2 daughters came along. They were so excited they couldn't tell me anything, but kept saying, "For God's sake, save us." People kept coming and getting into the cars on both sides. I recognized a man named Bartlett and his wife, and asked them what the trouble was. He replied, "Jim, everybody is burned out and everything is burning at Hinckley." The depot was on fire, and so was the bridge. I told the people to hurry onto the train, for I was going to run them back to Skunk Lake. Just as I spoke, everything seemed to let go, the wind rose, there seemed to be an explosion, and in an instant the whole train, even to the ties, was ignited all in less time than it takes a man to snap his finger. I had hardly taken my seat when the heavy glass in the cab window at my side bent over toward me and burst. The glass was carried to the top of the cab over my head, and as it came down it landed on me and cut me quite severely, although at the time I had no idea I was hurt at all. As we got into the cut on the top of Big Hinckley Hill I heard somebody calling. "Help!" 3 men were coming toward the train. I applied the air, at first thinking of taking them on, but a second thought told me it would not do to stop in the cut, as the fire would surely burn a hole in our air hose and set us there. So I released the air and we pulled out. 2 of the men caught onto the pilot as we went by. One of them remained there a short time, then fell off and was burned to death. The other went through all right and survived. I never could figure how he was able to hold on to that pilot. Then I must have passed out. The next thing I recollect is that we reached what we called Little Hinckley Hill. I was then lying on the deck of the engine with 1 foot on the quadrant, the other on the firebox door. I was alone in the cab. Vaguely I wondered what had happened to my fireman. My engine had slackened her speed and was going very slow. Looking up at the gauge I saw she had 90 pounds of steam. Then I pulled myself up, opened the throttle and sat on the seat again. At that moment Jack showed himself. He was inside the tender water tank. I began to get dizzy again. Jack must have noticed it. He threw water over me. It felt good. I told him my hands were cooked. "Mine are just the same," he replied. I thrust my swollen hands into the water. It relieved the pain and revived me. I asked Jack to throw in more coal. While he was doing that, I saw some water in a ditch at the side of the track. I knew we must have reached Skunk Lake, as there wasn't another drop of water within miles. I applied the air and stopped. I found we were right on the bridge, so I pulled the reverse lever to a forward motion and pulled ahead a car length or two. Then I fell to the deck of the engine. Jack wanted to help me, but I said I was all right and for him to get the passengers out into the water. The cars were all blazing, both inside and out. I learned later that all of their windows had been broken by the heat. There were about 300 passengers aboard. Just before reaching Skunk Lake, a dozen or more had gone mad and leaped off the train. More of them probably would have done so, especially the ladies, but for the fact that our porter, John Blair, went through one of the coaches with a fire extinguisher, squirting it on ladies' dresses wherever he saw they had caught fire. In a few minutes Jack came back, and he and another man helped me out of the engine. As soon as I struck the ground, I rolled into the water and lay there for 3 hours, and all of the passengers and the crew were in the water beside us. 430 men, women, and children. On the other side of the track was a larger body of water, also part of Skunk Lake. There were people in that, too, although nobody could see across the track at that time. There we sat. A few horses and cows had followed us into the lake, and a few deer, a couple of timber wolves, a black bear and other wild and domestic animals, all cowering and suffering there in the water with us. Showers of sparks rained down from all sides, and even flaming boughs and twigs whirled through the dense, smoky, oven-hot air. While we were waiting for the fire to die down a little, and watching the coaches burn, Jack and I suddenly decided to crawl back to the engine and save her, if possible. Jack pulled the pin, then I got into the cab and ran her ahead a few yards. This action partly saved the old girl, although everything burnable in her had already been destroyed. Then we got back into the water as quickly as possible. After waiting in that shallow, muddy lake for 4 agonizing hours, we were finally rescued by volunteers who came through with hand cars. Later we learned that 70 or more residents of Hinckley had saved their lives by a similar method. The Eastern Minnesota Railway had a gravel pit near its Hinckley depot, 2 or 3 acres of land hollowed out and partly protected from the tremendous blast of fire-filled wind. Fortunately, it contained a shallow pool of water. Into this crowded the Hinckleyites, followed by as much of their livestock as could reach the oasis, also a few wild animals. However, 120 other Hinckleyites met a terrible death when they sought shelter in a dry and parched slough located at the point where the wagon road crossed the eastern Minnesota track. Why they went there, nobody seemed to know, unless they vaguely recalled that the slough used to be filled with water. They could have taken either of the 2 emergency trains, or they could have gone to the gravel pit, or even into the narrow Grindstone River, but in moments of frenzy many people lose their heads altogether, and in this case the victims, hemmed in on 3 sides by the advancing curtain of fire, had headed in a 4th direction, north, in the futile hope of outracing the flames or perhaps finding some water still left in the slough. Their bodies were found later, huddled together in a pathetic mass. Indications were that they had been suffocated instantly by breathing the flame-laden air. Many were the heroes in that terrible emergency. I'll never forget Tom Dunn, our telegraph operator for the St. Paul and Duluth station at Hinckley. Tom refused to leave his post, because without his orders he knew the limited train would not be allowed to leave town. As it happened, our train didn't even get as far as the depot before we turned back, and Tom perished when the depot went up in flames. Another hero who fortunately survived was Bull Henley, a section hand at Hinckley, who waited in the road while flames licked his face and burned his clothes, and pointed out the way to bewildered Hinckleyites seeking the gravel pit. Many tales of heroism could be told about the railroad men who brought hand cars and rescue trains through the burning woods, and the generous public who supported them and later helped the dazed survivors to make a fresh start on their black and desolate farms. The flames burned for more than 5 days after Hinckley was destroyed, until they were quenched by a much belated rain which began falling on the 6th of September. In the fall season, hunters and trappers would come across the bodies of victims in the woods of upper Minnesota and Wisconsin, haunting reminders of the horror, the suffering and heroism of the Great Hinckley Fire. Today's episode was sponsored by FlagUpMailbox.com.